ideas about a sort of natalism, how you're going to treat parents versus non-parents, and just kind of a tendency to spout off on Twitter. And those things, while not necessarily great electorally, play super well in Silicon Valley. And I think we're part of the appeal to somebody like Peter Thiel, right? This kind of like trolling, always in the mixed mindset. It's very of a piece with, like, say, something like the All In podcast, very popular Silicon Valley podcast that has been pretty friendly to Trump this cycle. But of course, as we're discovering, isn't great necessarily if you're trying to win over swing voters. And during that primary, there was this huge fight essentially between Thiel and his supporters, his kind of group, and Mitch McConnell, and the sort of mainstream Republicans were not crazy about J.D. Vance initially, and essentially Thiel helped push him over the top, and they weren't crazy about him because of stuff like this, frankly. So we're sort of seeing a repeat of that, although it's playing out on a much in a much broader way.
What do we know, or what do you know? What can you tell us about the way Peter Thiel has been spending money, or been active or not active ahead of the 2024 election, especially since J.D. Vance was picked?
Yeah, Thiel was, of course, like the most famous, people will remember, who followed the race in 2016, probably the most famous business person who backed Donald Trump initially. Early on, Trump was seen as somebody who, many people in kind of the corporate world were not willing to, even be on the same stage with. Thiel donated $1 million to his campaign, or to a PAC supporting his campaign, endorsed him at the Republican National Convention, helped him do damage control after the kind of Access Hollywood tape. And Thiel essentially stepped back. In 2020, he became very active during the midterm, backing these kind of far-right, MAGA-aligned candidates, although not explicitly backing Donald Trump. So J.D. Vance was one of two senators that Thiel went really big in during the 2022 midterm. Both those guys, Vance and Blake Masters, won their primaries. Vance won his Senate seat. In 2024, it's been a little bit more subtle. Thiel has been, supportive of J.D. Vance behind the scenes, although he has not donated money to Donald Trump, and has said in various forums and in interviews that he's not planning to. But what you do have is this kind of Thiel network. Thiel famously is kind of the Don of the PayPal Mafia, as it's known. That's this group of investors and entrepreneurs connected to PayPal, the payment processing company that Thiel co-founded. And they are, many of these people, this includes Elon Musk, this includes David Sachs, a guy named Joe Lonsdale, who's also been active as a donor, and they have all been very involved in the 2024 race. So it's almost as if Thiel, by his example and his network, is having a big impact on the race, even if he hasn't opened his wallet yet.
Okay, very briefly, we know that a lot of these prominent VCs have a lot of money, they have large followings on Twitter. Does their support of the Republican Party, of Vance, of potentially Trump, does that bring more people to the polls? Does that move the needle in these swing states?
I think it's an open question. I think if you ask them, they would say, yeah, being against tech, the engine of the American economy, is a bad thing. Obviously, Joe Biden made a different calculation in 2020 and during his presidency. So I don't really know. I mean, there's been, at the same time that consumers are generally very supportive of these big tech companies, there's been a bit of a backlash. So I think it remains to be seen whether being beloved by somebody like Peter Thiel is electorally great. It's definitely good for raising money.
Max, thanks so much for joining us on this. No better person to talk about this. He's the author of The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. Max Chapkin, Bloomberg Business Week columnist, joining us from New York. Coming up next on Business Week, Doug Krisner gives us a preview of what's coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. This is Business Week. Catch complete coverage from the world of politics and the world of business on Bloomberg Balance of Power. Tune in for Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons tonight at 5 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio and television. Every
Every weeknight, your favorite Bloomberg podcasts are on Bloomberg Radio.
We've been discussing the Federal Reserve's latest move.
Immigration has become a hot topic in the U.S.
Tune in weeknights at 7 for the best from Pod Launch, The Big Take, Elon Inc., and all of our podcasts.
The Elon universe is a very complex cosmos.
The Podcast Spotlight Hour, weeknights at 7
We learn about a wide variety of subjects.
on Bloomberg 1130. Context changes everything. In the fast-paced world of financial services, a compliance revolution is coming. Imagine turning your firm's day-to-day business communications into your greatest asset. What if you could leverage communications data not just to satisfy compliance, but to prevent insider threats, predict risks, and protect against vulnerabilities? With Smarsh, you can unleash the power of regulatory-grade AI to stop risk before it happens. Visit smarsh.com/one to learn more. Smarsh.com/ONE.
Did you know that about 40% of Americans can trace their roots to Ellis Island? Discover your family's story with a visit to the Ellis Island Family History Center. Just a quick ferry ride from Battery Power Forward Liberty State Park. The Ellis Island database houses nearly 65 million records that detail the arrival of millions of immigrants to form the unique tapestry that is America. Research experts at the Family History Center can help you locate your connections to Ellis Island. To plan your visit, go to libertyellisfoundation.org.
When was the last time I took a road trip? How many national parks could I hit in 2 weeks? What about hotels? Wait, hey Erica, how much should I spend on travel?
When your questions about life turn into questions about money, there's Erica, the virtual financial assistant to help you spend, save, and plan smarter. Only from Bank of America. What would you like the power to do? Erica is only available in the English language. You must download the latest version of the mobile banking app, only available on select mobile devices. Your chat may be recorded and monitored for quality assurance. Message and data rates and additional terms made by Bank of America and a member FDIC.
Now, your 3-day weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
For tonight, any showers and followed by some clouds. Low temperatures by morning 70 and 75. And for Tuesday, it's a partly sunny, breezy, warm day near 85. Risk of an afternoon thunder shower, which will end tomorrow night, back in the 70s again. And partly sunny with afternoon thunderstorms on Wednesday, 85 to 90, and the 90s on Thursday. This is Gary Best with your 3-day weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
Coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week, we check in with Greg Krisner to give us a preview of what's coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. That's next on Bloomberg Business Week.
Now, your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Tesla shares advanced today by 5.6%. Morgan Stanley named the company as its new top pick within the U.S. auto sector, replacing Ford. And with more on the Tesla story, here's Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams.
Charlie, analyst Adam Jonas is maintaining his overweight rating and street-high $310 target on Tesla, while Ford is also still overweight among Morgan Stanley's coverage. Jonas says cost cuts and restructuring have helped to restrict the downside to Tesla's electric vehicles business. He also says Tesla may be cornering the market on zero-emissions vehicle credits, perhaps accounting for as much as half the credit sales in the market. In a note to clients, Jonas says he sees Tesla's China risks being managed while noting a higher contribution from recurring services revenue and good positioning within the energy storage portfolio. Charlie?
And that's Kimberly Adams reporting. We got Tesla up today by 5.6%. She mentioned Ford. Ford shares tumbled today by 1.6%. Morgan Stanley chief U.S. economist Emma Zentner is leaving her post to lead a newly created team within the bank's investment wing. According to an internal memo seen by Bloomberg, Zentner will be leading the new thematic and macro investing team at Morgan Stanley's global investment office beginning August 1st. Morgan Stanley declined today by 1.6%. An investor group led by Sixth Street has agreed to buy property and casualty insurer Enstar Group for $5.1 billion in the second largest private equity-backed insurance deal of the year. Enstar shares today did decline. Enstar was down by 6.1%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Jim Stanovic. on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenevec and Emily Grafeo in for Carol Master this afternoon. Also here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio is Doug Krisner, host of Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.
How are you guys doing? How was the show today?
Good.
Good.
Yeah, good show.
I feel like it went by quickly.
Yeah, it's always a good sign when it's a 3-hour program. We spoke with the CEO of Republic Services, huge waste management firm, $60 billion in market cap. And they missed on revenue. They cut their guidance last week. And he said a big reason is because of what's going on in new home construction. And it did not bounce, because that's a big part of their business, it did not bounce back as soon as they thought it would. We heard the exact same thing from Whirlpool CEO Mark Bitzer last week. New home sales, new home construction has not come back. They see it as temporary, but still.
When the Fed begins cutting interest rates, maybe that's what's going to cause the bond market to bring yields down even more than they've already dropped.
Yeah.
And that may revitalize it, although you have to think that maybe the Fed's justification for lowering interest rates is not only that inflation has come down, but it's the unemployment rate that's beginning to move higher, which means then if the economy is softening, perhaps fewer people will be compelled to go out and buy a home. So it cuts both ways, I think, right?
And Mike McKee also reminded us to think about the unemployment rate, but also the fact that the Fed, really all the Fed has to do is signal that it's going to cut. That loosens financial conditions almost to a degree where they don't have to cut as big if the market does some of the Fed's work for it. So I'm going to be thinking about that going into Wednesday.
That's a good point. I think right now swaps trading indicates 50 basis points in cuts between now and the end of the year. Could it be less than that, perhaps?
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see. The other thing, we have a BOJ meeting, and I don't know if did you see the New York Times? A front page story today about Japan wanted higher inflation. It's here, and it hurts.
Yeah.
You know, so now that they're building expectations for the BOJ to actually begin to raise rates right now, which is kind of different. But if you look at the juxtaposition, the yield differentials between what you get in Japan and what you have in the United States, obviously it favors the United States given the higher yield. If that can begin to soften a bit as the market, Emily, you pointed out, the bond market bringing rates down, as the BOJ begins to tighten, maybe that becomes a little bit more, I don't want to say in equilibrium, for money flowing back into Japan a little bit. The yen has showed remarkable strength recently, and a lot of that I think is tied to the expectation that the BOJ is going to, it has no choice at this point except to tighten.
Okay, the Bank of Japan, again, on your radar.
Right, that's one thing.
What else is on the program tonight?
Good question. You know, it's kind of a week where we're very much waiting for big and mega cap tech earnings, you know, because the AI trade, particularly as it shows up with companies like TSMC, the big chip manufacturer in Taiwan, to a lesser extent some of the chip suppliers and manufacturers in Japan. When the AI narrative begins to change, the ripples go right across the water, and they show up in places like Taiwan or Japan, as I mentioned.
So we got Microsoft this week.
Yeah,
we got Meta Platforms.
Meta.
We got Apple on Thursday.
And Amazon is in there as well. But when you talk about the investment, we talked a little bit about this on the weekend segment, the investments that some of these companies are making in AI on the front end and have yet to see a return on investment. And so that's really what a company like Meta is going to have to demonstrate, that we've put all of this money into AI. What are we beginning to see, or what is the potential return? I think that's going to, the guidance on that, I think, is going to be very.
We haven't seen it yet in the earnings so far.
Right, we haven't. We did have Red Brown come on with us, and he mentioned that revenues projected to increase 20% at Meta Platforms, almost twice the rate a year earlier. So
that would be phenomenal. I think, in
that
the
would
current
be
environment.
Yeah, the current environment. So maybe AI, they're using AI on the ad side.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see until later this week. Doug Krisner.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for a little preview. Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, and thank you, Emily Grafeo, in for Carol Master. That does it for Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Tim Stenevec with Emily Grafeo. Bloomberg Balance of Power starts now.